Cool. All right. My name is Nilson Carroll. I'm 29 now, although I usually tell people I'm around 16. I'm currently an MFA student at Visual Studies Workshop in New York, in Rochester, New York. I studied playwriting at SUNY Oswego many years ago, but I make games. I do a lot of sort of intermedia, new media work. I make a lot of 16mm films and do sort of like projector performances and expanded cinema kind of performances. I also do a lot with like glitch work and working on like live glitch sort of like, performances and like shows and stuff. Lately I've been just been at home. In 2019 I started sort of like a queer art games collective here in Rochester called Swampbabes. And we were able to have one show before the pandemic started, and that was like last winter. And so we showed like 20 experimental films derived from video game footage, and we were able to do that in like a public space, which is very cool in Rochester. Yeah, I don't know. I do a lot of things. I've dealt with a lot of sort of like Rom hacks in the past. Really, I think I got my start in thinking about games as art and like art as games. Early on, I was probably like 11 or 12. This is sort of like my origin story, I guess. I was like 11 or 12, and I was, really getting into like early 2000 internet culture, and I was like learning about like emulation and ROM hacks and things, and I found this ROM hack called Dragon Pervert on the internet. Like, what is this? And so I played it, and it was a hack of Dragon Warrior 1 on the NES, and it was like just like really juvenile and like just like totally perverted, and like they changed like the slimes into penises or whatever, and just like changed like all the words to this like really like like rudimentary like boys bathroom graffiti level perverted stuff. And even then I was like 12, so I was like old enough to like know like it wasn't my sense of humor, like I knew it was, it wasn't for me. But what was surprising was just like, oh, like I didn't know that, like a game like this could exist. So it felt very, I wouldn't have described it as like avant-garde when I was 12, obviously, but like in retrospect, it's like totally avant-garde, and it was just like that Dragon Pervert has always been in the back of my head of this like, like radical game making. And then years later, I actually met one of the dudes who did that hack, and we actually made a ROM hack together. He actually taught me how to ROM hack. And that was like, I don't know, like 8 years ago now, and me and him are like buddies. But he made that game when he was like 13, in like 1999. It was shocking how radical it was.
Well, what do you think? I mean, I guess that's a good a point of entry as any. Although I don't want to cut you off if
no.
if you were pulling that thread somewhere else.
No. Please.
Please interrupt me.
Yeah.
I think. Well, like those are exciting words, like radical game making, and like I guess. I don't know. I mean, I feel like in connection with like the collective you're talking about, that you got to technically, physically be a collective once.
Yeah.
And in connection with some of the stuff I think we were talking about on email.
Yeah.
I feel like, when it comes to the concept of the word inclusion as it's sort of understood in whatever it is we mean when we talk about like broader video game culture, like maybe it's worth talking about like how do we discern the word inclusion overall, but is there a way, or does it ever feel like hollow, sort of the way inclusion is being championed now, or like, because I feel like if you're talking about things being radical, like, well, there's new directions we can go in that like you never thought about, or maybe most people have never thought about. So that's kind of like a broad place to start. That's it.
So yeah, well, I would also, to give a little more context about like Dragon Pervert, I'm totally into like applying queer theory to my game making. It's like games in general, and like thinking about, how do we push games to be more, inclusive and insightful and sensitive, and all of these things. And then like Dragon Pervert is so like if that came out today and like no one had ever seen it before, we'd be like what the hell? Like, who are these like assholes who made this game? Like, this game's terrible. Like, it's offensive. It's so bad. It's like this like dirty joke that like nobody wants to hear. And so for me to like kind of champion playing that game as my sort of origin story, like, it's really complicated, and I like sort of apologize for like bringing it up in a way. And so a lot of what I think about is like, why do I like this thing that's so problematic, and how do I contextualize it to like, make sense in the grand scheme of things and make sense in my own work, which, for me, like, I always try to make, very sensitive games and like very autobiographical, and sort of like softness and cuteness are like some of my, most like highest values. But like I love this like dirty thing, and it's difficult. And and you go to like some of these Rom Hack websites, and like I know a lot of these people, so like I know how some of them behave, and like they call them. There's ROM hacks. I don't know if I need to like explain what a ROM hack is. I don't, is that necessary?
I mean, I guess it can't hurt. I mean, I know.
Yeah. So
I know what you mean, but there's probably going to be people who are like, "What is that?" I guess they can Google it, but I don't know if Google is going to agree with what you and I agree on here.
Sure. Well, so just really quickly, like a ROM hack is very often, people on the internet typically will take apart sort of, the code of usually like a retro game, often to, almost correct it, or like if it's in Japanese, like bring it from Japanese into English language or other language, like fan translations. Sometimes a ROM hack is just like, like an artist wants to make a completely new game by like changing the graphics or changing the words, or like writing their own story inside like the code of an old game. And then there are also bad hacks. Like there's ROM hacks and there's bad hacks, and bad hacks are what Dragon Pervert is, and like it's very much like making these games sort of perverted in a very rudimentary and childish way, and just like like causing a scene with them, and like making them dirty, and making them like sometimes very weird. And so you go on some of these bad hack forums, and it's like, oh man, it's really like I can't align myself with this community, 'cause it's like really troubling, and like some of the things that they say are very troubling and very problematic. And here I am, this like, trying to present myself as like this very like sensitive person, trying to like foster this like queer game art community, IRL, but like this bad hack problem is always looming over, me and my work, and I'm not sure what to do about that. It's very complicated.
Mhm.
So, I don't know.
Well, so just I mean, I guess I don't know if this is directly related, but and maybe it's unfair, because like I think I'm asking you, like, maybe in part as an observer as well, like when it comes to wherever it is you may see broader discussions of inclusion. I mean, I guess maybe the question is less like, well, maybe it's the same thing, like in part like, well, where does it maybe kind of feel hollow, but also like, well, where and in what context are people patting themselves on the back where maybe instead they should be like scratching their chin or like thinking a little more deeply about what's going on.
Definitely. Yeah, so, talking about inclusion, definitely in like mainstream video games, which I don't play a lot of, but I keep up pretty up to date with what's going on, and I feel like there's this idea that making your characters queer characters like makes your game somehow more inclusive, and in a way it does. I think inclusion on that level is still very important, and like seeing queer characters and characters of color, like that's so wonderful. Like I'm glad that that's happening, but it's definitely not enough to include those characters, but including them into like the same violent, capitalist, imperialist, video game hierarchy that has always existed. The games aren't any more radical. And I think that's important to remember.
I mean, I feel like, I don't know. It seems like for some sort of critical mass that seems to be a satisfying approach, and maybe part of the problem is like often when we talk about video games, they're discussed as like all under one big, like they're all in one big tent. Like I was going to say like one big circus tent, but that sort of seems to imply like maybe there's some sort of freak show also happening.
Yeah, sure.
But I feel like I kept waiting for there to be some sort of piece over the last few years where it's like, well, why is it just like you kind of switch in a different character and they're still doing the same things? It's like, well, how is this really any different? But I don't know. I feel like even though like that portion of video games, like the really big commercial part of it, like, yeah, it makes a lot of money, it deals in a lot of money. I feel like I'm starting to feel like, well, maybe we place too much importance on them, even though they are among the most lucrative. But I don't know what you do with that thought other than as an individual sort of like kind of turn away,
It certainly feels like a lost cause. It's so far removed from anything that I'm dealing with or talking about ever, that it doesn't. Yeah, it really like doesn't affect me anymore, and I always feel so silly. Like I'll be working at my job or whatever, and then like, oh, like what does Nilson do again? And it's like, oh, I think Nilson like does something with video games or something. I don't know. And they're like, oh, Nilson, like what do you have to say about Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2 that just came out? And I'm like, I don't know. Like, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but I have no idea. And yeah, I'm totally, outside of that world, and I still, I read like, Polygon, like the front page of Polygon, like every couple of days, so like I know what's going on, but it's really removed, I think, from what I'm dealing with.
Well, removed how? So like, you talked about being into things that you called radical, what in what ways are, because that's the challenging thing that like I find is, I have a lot of these conversations with people who are interested in talking about these things, but like a parallel path is like, well, I'm having all these conversations with people who understand it to try to figure out how to translate it and like get people who don't understand this stuff to like maybe find ways where either they could like care about things that are happening in it, or just like a broader interest that I have in like zooming out and connecting it to more things. So I mean, I guess in a way, you know, when you talk about engaging with what seems to be for the majority of people, like, oh well, yeah, those are the websites you go to read about video games, or yeah, these are even indeed like this is the concept of a video game, like like maybe it's kind of dull to get into, but like in what ways to you, you know, are those things not radical, or like as you said, like how are they removed from what you care about?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I think I mentioned this in one of the emails. Like, I'm always thinking about verbs, you know, and like what verbs are we dealing with in games? And it's always like to kill, like to fight, to win, and those are just
yeah. I was just gonna say, is this what you were talking about, like the hollowness in games in our email? Like a lot of play in games sort of feels hollow. Yeah.
Absolutely, and it's just like a thing that I'll often do is I'll be, and not recently obviously, but like if I'm at like a party or something, I'm not good at parties, so like I'll just sit on a couch and like play a video game for like the entire party, and like people kind of come and go and like watch, and you know, and the probably one of the last parties I was at, I was playing Dark Souls 1. I was doing like a Dark Souls 1 speed run, and I was just like killing these, you know, these like skeletons and like animals, and it's like murdering like all these creatures, and it was definitely the kind of party that like not people who play a lot of games, like no one there had probably ever even seen Dark Souls, or you know. And I was just like playing this game, and it was like, and it's like pretty stylized, like it's very fantasy. It's not very realistic, but it's still like the violence. You like it's heavy, you feel it, and it's like killing all these animals, and the people are watching, and I just started feeling so guilty. Like I'm so sorry. Like I really don't want to be doing this in front of anybody. Like I feel so guilty and bad to like bring up this violence like at this social gathering. Like I don't feel good about that at all. And like, you know, if you're playing a game like A Short Hike, which is very nice, you know, there's just like, you're not conjuring violence like into the world. You're just doing like this nice like chill thing, and I wish there was more of that, you know, in general. I wish there was more of that, but definitely in mainstream games, like I wish there was more of, you know, just like different verbs and different, you know, attitudes and tones, and you know, I think, I don't know, yeah, violence just, the older I get, the less it sits right with me, I feel like.
Yeah, please go ahead.
I was also just going to say that I feel like, you know, and this might be like a naive thing to say, but I feel like mainstream games are so designed to earn money above all else, you know, and they're so heavily designed to like appeal to audiences, and you know, obviously like kids want to play violent games, like violence is cool, you know, like yeah, you know, we want to sell those games, and I like, obviously somebody can't just like sit around and like make a bunch of really great games and like not expect to earn any money. Like that's not how the world works. Right. But I feel like the super heavy capitalist system is impeding on like the artistic value of games in general.
Yeah, I mean, just thinking about it, I mean, you had mentioned, I guess some people, I never know, like some people sort of scoff at the are games art or games are art sort of discussions, and something I've been thinking about lately. I read Jerry Saltz's book, How to Be an Artist, which I don't know if he's on your radar at all, or if you know.
I've not read that book. No.
Yeah, so it's a quick read, and there's a part in it, I believe. I've read a couple books since then, so I mean, hopefully I'm not blurring together, and that's not me trying to brag about being literate.
No, that's fine.
Oh, whoops! Check out all the books tumbling out of my brain. Wow. No, I mean, there's a part of it. Because like I often find that frame really interesting because I know people. Like I know like museum curators, or I know people who are, you know, whatever it is we call the art world. And they talk about how, well, no one can even agree on what art is. And in this book, Jerry Saltz talks about how it's kind of ludicrous for, you know, art, you know, it's in the weird way it gets personified, in the way video games gets personified. Jerry Saltz writes about how it's kind of absurd for, like, people to act like, you know, we've seen everything that art is capable of because... you know, just many of the same sort of ways that video games haven't been inclusive. And so I don't really know what the question is in there other than like, well, what are these conversations really about? Like, if it is about legitimacy, it feels really weird where it's like, yeah, games are art because in Dark Souls, you can run around in your underwear and kill stuff.
Cool.
So... I mean, it feels really, you know, it's really easy to like say those sort of cheesy things, but I guess, yeah. I mean, I don't know why we're starting on this hollow note, but
yeah.
I feel like the direction you're going in is like, well, okay, so you've had this realization, and you're not just gonna, but you're still gonna be involved. So like, what is it about video games that like still makes you interested, despite you know, a lot of stuff on the surface just sort of being either alienating, problematic, or just kind of stupid?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I think I might have a few answers to it.
Sure.
The first thing I would say is that I live in Rochester, New York. It's like a medium-sized upstate western New York City, and we have a pretty vibrant art scene. There's like a lot of, you know, like painters and like there's a lot of ceramics around, and it's like a pretty vibrant artist community. And we also have Rochester Institute of Technology, which is like a very major tech school, and they have a very major game degree there. And those two worlds like never cross, which I always thought was really interesting. Like game students go to school to make games that are gonna sell on Steam, and like you talk to, you know, like a lot of the people that I know that went through there, like, this is like my really great game idea, like it's going to sell 1 million copies. And then, you know, you talk to the art community and it's like, oh, like I'm going to paint all these paintings and like I'm going to sell so many paintings, like this is how I'm going to do it. And so like that's like very troubling to me that like it's such a capitalist endeavor. And like you'll go into, I used to work at an art gallery. There's a few like small, medium-sized art galleries in town, and it's like, if you wanted to, you know, propose or show like a video game artwork, like no one would know what you're talking about. And not only would they not know what you're talking about, but like they would be annoyed at you. And like that's really troubling to me, you know. And it's just thinking about like, you know, I used to work in an art gallery. I worked there for many years, and like I helped like install exhibitions and all sorts of things. And it's like, oh, like you want to show a video game in an art space? Like, are you gonna, like, what are you gonna do with the controller? Like, do you need a keyboard, or like what? There's like all these problems that, you know, you don't have to deal with if you're just hanging a painting. And like I love those problems. Like, those
Yeah.
problems to me are so rich, and like that's sort of like that's like very radical to have to, to accept those problems and then like overcome those problems. And I'm a strong advocate of like, yeah, like games online are like, that's like the obvious fit, but games in person, like games physically in art spaces, like that's where the meat is, and that's how like in-person communities form, and like that's very exciting to me. But it seems so hard. Like, nobody wants to do that. Nobody sees any value in that. At least, in my city. Obviously, if you're in like New York City or something, there's spaces like Baby Castles that are doing exactly that. But the art community at large is sort of on the fence about it still, and that feels very radical to me to like want to push on that a little bit. And I think it's it almost becomes like a queer problem to like queering the art gallery, or like dealing with like bodies and spaces and how bodies are interacting with the artwork that you're showing. Like, that's very interesting to me, and I think it's totally worthwhile to overcome. But
I mean, I was always interested in it's similar to things you've been talking about so far, where there have been instances of video games exhibited in galleries or in museums, and I don't know, it feels very contrarian to say it. I think it's just because I've had a number of conversations with people who have had their work featured.
Sure.
And also people who have been part of the discussions in in navigating those annoying problems that you were talking about. And
totally.
I always, I mean, what I go towards is like, well, who is benefiting in this relationship? Because the thing I hear from a lot of developers, maybe that's the wrong way to think about it, who is benefiting, but it just feels like if there's so much traction against a certain thing, where there are so many other things we talk about as being similar to video games, I just feel like it invites certain questions. But I'm like a curious dude, so maybe it's not a shock that I have questions about it. But like I think about like people I know who have had their work, their games in those places. They talk about how they keep close track of whatever metrics on traffic or sales, and it seems to make no real difference. After day of their first being in that sort of space, they certainly don't hear from more people. I always felt like, oh, this would be an interesting article to write if there was a place to go and actually write about it, because it sort of feels like my working theory based on, to be fair, these hundreds of conversations that I've had. It feels like museums trying to get butts in seats. Which I don't know if that's fair to assert, or is just a necessary flavor that this dynamic has when it's still so new. But I feel like if that is the dynamic, it would sort of necessarily repel the sort of radical stuff you're talking about, which is kind of what I thought was the point of galleries and stuff, was to have provocative, interesting, unique work. But I don't know.
Anymore.
I don't. I mean, originally, but I also don't claim to be in the art world. I don't know that there's a question in there, but if you have a reaction, I would be curious to hear sort of like what that sort of brought to mind.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many different ways to, frame a video game, or like a video game adjacent artwork, being shown in a small gallery or a medium-sized gallery or like a huge, museum. I think one of the first times I ever saw a video game in any kind of like art museum context, I think I was at MoMA, and in they have like a design exhibition, and I think they were showing Street Fighter 2, like gameplay of it. Not like, I don't think you could actually play it. It was just gameplay of it, and it was like Street Fighter 2. It's like this like design object, and I think Street Fighter 2 is like a really great design object, but that doesn't make it, I always have trouble thinking about games as design objects because like it feels more like a product then if we're talking about them as design objects, and like a lot of games are like really well designed, but it almost seems like it's diminishing, like that radical value, and it's like, I don't know if this makes any sense, but it almost explains away like the inherent magic I see in a game. Like if you were just like walking down the hallway in MoMA and like Street Fighter 2 was there, and this is probably like 10, 15 years ago, so like things have changed since then, but if you're just like walking in a hallway in MoMA, 10 years ago and you saw Street Fighter 2, you'd be like, whoa, like what? Like what's going on? But, MoMA had like all this text and it was like, why is this here? Like, this is a design object, and it's just like, it kind of explained away like what I was excited about, just like seeing a video game in like a huge museum like that. Like that was cool. But since then, I think things have changed, and like, there's a handful of seemingly successful, game-specific, smaller art galleries, in the country, in New York City, and is it Pittsburgh? I think there's one in Chicago, and in Toronto, I think.
Mm-hmm. Well, I wonder if part of it, I mean, I'm familiar with the video games need more verbs way of thinking, but I wonder if we need more adjectives or verbs too in the way we talk about video games. I mean, is part of what reduces the magic? Because I know you said that, like in our emails, like they're more than just a nice design object that's quite beautiful. Are there just things missing in the way we talk about video games? You sent me over one of your videos. I guess that was yesterday.
Yeah.
And I like, for example, like I felt like I wish there was a better way in talking about video games to articulate like, all right, it's kind of enough.
Yeah.
With this or with that, which I think is tough to say because like everyone's path through is different, and but it does feel like there is a critical mass of a lot of people feeling a certain way, but having no one to talk to, or just learning to talk less. So maybe it's more a question of like, well, what sort of ways of talking about video games would you like to see spread more widely, or like what ways of talking about video games in general do you feel are just missing altogether?
Yeah, I mean, in like the most mainstream way of speaking, like I think in general it's a lot better than it has been, over the past, like since like the 90s, like 90s game journalism / like reviewing was like very juvenile, and a lot of game reviewers who are reviewing like mainstream and like indie games now are like, I'm not putting a review score on my game, on my review of the game, like that's dumb, like we're not thinking about games like that anymore, like we don't want to rank them and give them numbers, like we're just going to talk about them, we're just going to like discuss them. And I think that's like a step in the right direction, to stop kind of talking about them like cars, like stop talking about them like cars, or like, I don't know, like kitchen appliances, like which one like 10 out of 10, which one's 9 out of 10, like which one's 8 out of 10. Like don't do that. We don't need to do that. And I love the idea of people writing, reviews of games and using like literary and art criticism to like approach games, and then like also like inserting, autobiography into reviews. I always think is really successful. But so the video that you mentioned, I do 100 push-ups while I'm listing like my top 100 video games, and it kills me. Like it really hurts me.
No, it's clear. It's clear.
Yeah, and like that is such a I'm like, fuck your lists. Like these lists are stupid, and like, but like I have my list. Like I love my list. I love tinkering around with it and like thinking about it. For me personally, like that's just something I enjoy doing. But like the problem is when like these lists like come up, and it's sort of this like dick measuring contest of like between games and between like reviewers, and thinking about games that in such a like sort of like masculine competition way.
Yeah.
But I sort of do think you see less of that than you used to.
Well, what about this? I mean, because I guess I'm curious for you personally, like, given what we've sort of talked about, this feeling of like, if not wholly, like certainly there are just a lot of elements about the most mainstream-facing video games that are kind of juvenile, that are still pretty violent. I mean, I don't know that like the core character of what a lot of like those major video games has changed that much. They certainly look different now compared to the 90s, but I mean, I guess I'm curious, like, I wonder this a lot too, like, well, do those sorts of things, do they deserve those sort of, literary devices that you're talking about? Because I often wonder, like, well, maybe just broadly, a lot of video games are just really bad, and maybe the reason all these other things aren't better is because they don't deserve them, and because they aren't there yet to really inspire it. I think the thing that's tough is, like, it still feels like there are these, like, these invisible walls up where, like, for people whose identities aren't solely defined by an interest in video games, it's like you don't get to bring these other parts of you into it. So, I mean, I would be curious to hear you respond. Like, how do you reconcile that? Like, seeing like literary devices in a review of whatever it is. I mean, are they deserving of it, or I don't even want to start a binary there, but kind of just five questions there in one. I think it's just interesting to think about, especially as people who provide criticism or people who are trying to I don't know what it is I'm doing now. I guess it's still criticism. It's just taking a different form.
I mean, I whether or not like a game or games, deserve that kind of attention, I always am interested in that kind of attention being applied to them, and like thinking deeper, and sort of using a history of thought, a history of like thinking about culture. I think is always like, it's like a step in the right direction, and I think it's fine whether or not like it's being done correctly or whatever. Like that's anyone, I don't know, but I think it's good. And honestly, like a lot of games probably don't deserve that kind of attention, but that's fine too. It's like a nice, nice exercise.
I'm not trying to sound like I'm arguing against it. I suppose the other difficult thing too is like it just feels like in a lineage of criticism in video games, there's not much institutional memory. So in some ways it's like, I guess, I don't know. Yeah, I mean, these are stepping stones that may lead to some sort of whatever later, but it does feel less of an anomaly now, but it definitely still feels like an anomaly. I mean, it doesn't feel like an anomaly in my life because I know a lot of people who are frustrated and would like to provide that sort of thing, but they just have nowhere.
Yeah.
They have nowhere to go. You know.
Yeah. I definitely think too that as we get, further away from, the origin of, video games, like as video games have just like been around longer, we start to see in retrospect patterns, and we start to understand that history a little bit better, and like the whole scope of it. And I think thinking about things that way is like very important, and sort of trying to understand the pattern of like, why are we where we are now? Like, how did that come about? And so that's sort of, coming at games from a more, like social, like historical approach, which like that seems to be super vital right now and seems very important to me. And it seems like a lot of, scholars are interested in doing that work. So that's good. Like, it's good to get that on, paper, and it's good to like think about it and be critical about it too. I think we need more. I think we need harsher criticism in games.
Harsher how?
Less like, not harsher, like meaner, but like, you can open any, review on like Destructoid, and like every game gets like a 7 or 8 out of 10, and like, it's, I don't know, there's something that, I mean, on one hand, it's like all these personalities on the internet like know each other, and they're like friends on Twitter, and like you don't want to like hurt, your dev friends, or like give somebody a bad review score. But if we're going to continue down the path of like thinking about games as art, and like being very critical about games, and we need to, I don't know, not be harsher, but like be more willing to like be more critical, I think. And I see that, so I mean, again, like from my like Rochester, New York lens, like nobody can be critical about anything in this town because everybody knows each other, and it's such a small town, and like you don't want to, hurt your friend for like, writing like a review of their, art exhibition. Like, you can't do that. Like, it's not in that ecosystem, and it's really hard to talk about games because even though it's like this massive thing, like everybody kind of knows each other, or is like one person away from knowing each other, and but again, and now I'm going to completely like disregard like what I just said and be like, well, on the other hand, like fuck that, like we should all be nice and be friends, and like like, no, like do that, like fuck your criticism, like we should all just like get along, and like that's the most important thing. And so, how do you find that balance? How do you be like a very critical critic, but then also like sort of champion like all these things that should be championed, especially like smaller, devs and indie games and stuff. You don't want to, screw them over with like a bad review or something.
Well, maybe it's not helpful. I mean, I think it makes it slightly less schizophrenic, but it's like, I think, I don't know if it's possible for the same individual to embody both those things. I mean, that would be great, but I feel like it probably breaks down in terms of like different people feeling like that's their sort of home base philosophy, and they go towards that, and maybe it will sort of quote unquote balance out people who are pushing in the other direction. But I mean, if you say like be willing to be more critical, and I know this is the sort of question where it immediately goes out of your head when you're asked, but be more critical. If specifics don't come to mind, like in general, like what sort of things would you like to see be explored more, or to be more the domain of criticism? Because I'm going to guess you're not going to suggest other people also do push-ups, although maybe.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I can, think of an example,
Yeah.
like an example of, like, say there's, a show at Baby Castles is always my example. Like, say there's a show at Baby Castles that, like, says that they're exploring a theme, and then no one's gonna be like, oh, like, I can think of 5 other game artists that are, like, way better and, like, fit that theme so much better, and, like, those are the voices that you should actually be championing. Like, you messed up, like, no one's gonna do that. Like, there's no room for that. And, like, it's like saying that out loud right now, like, I feel nasty. I'm like, ugh, like, I don't even think I should be saying that as, like, a fake example, because it seems malicious, even though it's like, it's just discourse. It's just, like a critic doing what a critic does, and, like, making suggestions and things like that. But it's hard. It's hard to do that, and I don't really see a lot of that on, like, Twitter or whatever, except when, like, somebody's really willing to, like, like, burn a bridge or something, or just, like, shit posting for the sake of shit posting,
Well, something I've observed is it feels like, I don't know, it feels like when there have been attempts at that sort of criticism, not necessarily coming from a critic, but, like, say a person who works at a game company, or it can come from any point. It either falls on deaf ears, I feel like, or it's perceived as, like, oh, they're trying to cultivate, like, a certain persona where,
sure, no, totally.
They're wearing sunglasses inside. They got the back of the baseball cap, and I mean, in the way where it's kind of dismissed and yet taken, seriously, because there are tons of examples of people who are contrarian, and, literally their persona is, like, they wear dark jackets and sunglasses, and oh, I gave the game a 1 out of 10.
Yeah.
Or whatever it is, Like it feels like this sort of try-hard way of making a name for yourself. So I feel like I wish there was more space in between those two, because it's like, hey, in some ways too, I wonder, like, well, are we still just clinging to, like, these, like, stigmas from the 80s and 90s, and still feeling like, oh no, if we criticize video games, they're going to go away? And it's like, I mean, there's a question in there. I mean, like, do you feel like is that part of it, why there can still sometimes be this kind of defensive, dismissive, or derisive response to things that are actually good points, and I think kind of discourage us hearing more of it,
Yeah. Yeah, and I guess I would add that, like, I personally am far more comfortable, throwing my critique at, either, like, a larger company or, like, a larger art institution, for instance, rather than, like, some, like, game artist, on Twitter. Like, leave them alone. Like, it's the critique the power structures, critique the people who have the money and are spending the money in certain ways. Like, that's, I think, what we should actually be focusing on. And I think if we thought more in that way, it'd be easier to be more critical, because now you're not necessarily stepping on, people's toes or whatever, It's not as personal. And honestly, I think it's more, you're speaking more truth to power that way, by being critical of institutions and game companies.
Right. Well, I mean, to sort of shift gears, I mean, you were talking a bit about how, thinking about games and sort of the way they can tell us sort of where we are and why we are, and you have delved much deeper into the world of ROM hacks than I have, and I mean, I guess I would be curious to hear you talk about like do you think of ROM hacks as sort of like something analogous to folk art? Like what do ROM hacks sort of tell you about, like, where we're at and why we're at.
Wow. I've been waiting 20 years for somebody to ask me that question.
Are you serious?
I mean, sure, yeah. It's like a nice conversation.
All right. Sorry, I'm late. Sorry, I'm late.
Well, I'll say this first of all. Are you familiar with Corey Archangel's work, the artist?
Yeah. So, I was trying to just saying yes, of course, because I feel like he's kind of the token example of this thing, and yet it's interesting because I feel like people I know. I guess it makes sense. People I know in video games scoff at his work.
Yeah.
People I know the other way are in awe of it. So I've heard many strong opinions, but it would probably be good for you to explain who Corey is, because I sort of
Corey Archangel. He's really famous for a few artworks, but I think he's probably most famous for Super Mario Clouds, which is this Super Mario 1 ROM hack that he does with actual, Nintendo hardware. And he takes out all of like the Mario gameplay, and it's just like the clouds scrolling through. And I think that work is probably from the year 2001, maybe. So it's like an older work now, and it's funny that like most of the ROM hackers that I've interacted with have probably never or like I know have never heard of Corey Archangel, who's this like major like ROM hack, internationally known artist. And it's also interesting to like think about it in terms of art history, and like there was never really like another ROM hack artist, and a lot of artists that I talk to, and especially in like my MFA program, it's like nobody knows. I'm in there like every week telling somebody like what I'm talking about, like this is what a ROM hack is, and like Nilson, like what are you talking about, like like go back to photography, like you're speaking a different language. So there's definitely something in sort of this like mainstream art, but like MFA level that like even today, like he hasn't quite permeated. There's definitely, and that's just like in my workshops and stuff, there's definitely like, he's really well known. Like a lot of people know who he is. And I've actually sent him an email one time. I was like, oh, Corey, like, I just go into like my MFA program every week, and like I have to explain what a ROM hack is. Like nobody likes me. Like what do I do? He never responded, but I always hope he'd one day.
Yeah, in a way, maybe he did respond.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
If it makes you feel any better, I tried to get him for an interview years ago, and I also did not get a response. So in a way, he did give me an interview.
Yeah. I'm sure he's around somewhere.
Oh, I'm sure. It's fine. It's fine.
But I had never thought about ROM hacks as being folk art, but I think that's a really interesting parallel. There's anyone who endeavors to like spend a lot of time with ROM hacking, be it fan translations or be it bad hacks or making your own game inside of like Pokemon or whatever, like it's definitely analogous to folk art. There's, in a way, it's sort of like outsider art or like outsider game dev. And then at the same time, like people who are really good at this, like know more about how games work than like any game dev, out there. And they're like dealing with like assembly at like such a like microscopic level, and it's such a skill. It's like the most, like intense skill, and there's no reward for it. There's no fame or fortune behind it. Often these projects go, under like a website username, and that's like, the only thing attached to it. And it's not really a skill that was like has like real world benefits. But people do it. People put, their heart and soul and so much passion into these projects, and that's really interesting to me, and I love the idea of like any, like really intense project that, like a project, like an art project comes out of it, and there's no capital gain. There's something pure about that, I think.
So the people you're trying to explain it to, why don't they get it? Because I feel like in a way, sort of indirectly, what you're talking about, even though I know ROM hacks are not new, in a way it does feel like a microcosm for like what video games are on the whole, which is like this thing that is pretty popular and yet at the same time still pretty arcane.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally.
But I don't know what that means on a more cosmic level, because I don't know what sort of conversation. I know what conversations I have with people whose eyes gloss over or their voice just drops down a couple octaves when I'm trying to explain it. But like, what does that say about like, the greater whole? Like what do you? Because I feel like you've had so many of those conversations that you reached out to Corey that you must have drawn some sort of conclusion, even if it's just I am frustrated.
Yeah, I mean, like at that sort of strange niche intersection of, very like using video games in a very obscure way, and then like new media and art, like that intersection, I personally, have been in the past like frustrated being in that spot, like being obsessed with like these things that like no one else can understand or like cares much about, or is like misinterpreting as like something else. And I wish that I could like foster more spaces for that kind of thing to be contextualized and like gain attention and importance and just like be understood a little bit better. But I would I'll like walk out of like, my MFA school's building, and like this woman will be like, Nilson, like you've told me what a ROM hack is 10 times and now I understand. Like, oh wow, like that's really amazing. Like that not that like, I necessarily want to be a teacher or anything, but just like, yeah, like this thing exists and like people think it's important and it has a lot to do with like what I'm talking about, and like now you know what it is a little bit better, and that's cool. And I love, talking about like the Swampbabes video exhibition. It was in this storefront window, and so it was facing the sidewalk of like a busy street, and most people that saw it, don't think about art and video games, and they're just like going to work. And like I love putting these like that sort of thing in this position to be seen by, not art audiences, but just like people walking down the street, and it's like, get them thinking a little bit. Like, why is there all these like weird videos in this like abandoned storefront? Like, ask questions. Like that's what I'm ultimately trying to do, is just like prod, more questions to be asked.
I feel like I think what's interesting about you have more than one outlet, but the thing that I think is interesting about the exhibit stuff, even though I guess arguably what you're doing elsewhere is a continuation of it. Like I feel like, I want to ask you about this thing you wrote about how video games aren't public yet in the way that other art is.
Yeah.
I don't remember how long ago we emailed, or if you even remember saying that.
Yeah.
But I guess that was last week, wasn't it?
Probably a couple days ago, yeah.
Yeah. But I think what I find interesting is exactly what you said about it. Well, people aren't asking questions, and they feel like there is this weird contrast where like they are arcane and yet they're kind of everywhere, but what is sort of being lost, like I think it's sort of, I think my experiences getting interested in video games sort of echo what you described with Dragon Pervert, which is just like, you didn't articulate it in this way, but I feel like that's sort of the way you felt, which is like, what is this?
Yeah, totally.
like it's like this thing of like, well, it's like, for me growing up, that was sort of the feeling that like, video games, they come from Japan. It has this very clear feeling it was not meant for me. It had this feeling more of like it escaped, and like I got to witness this thing that was, made by people I don't know, far away, that probably if it was up to them, it would have just stayed in Japan. And so I feel like, as it has become more commonplace, it's interesting. It's like there seem to be fewer questions when in fact there should be more.
Yeah.
And I don't know how that fits in with like they aren't public yet, but is that some of what you meant of like, I don't know, like how is that possible? I guess that, at the same time they seem to be in so many places. You can see them on, sides of buses. You can see them, during, even like before movies, back when, or maybe you're still going to movie theaters, but like, you would see them. I mean, they've kind of just like invaded in all these surprising places that kind of make sense, and yet the concept of a ROM hack, I get maybe why that would be so weird, but is that some of what you were talking about, though, where you were just saying like video games just aren't public yet in the way that other art is, that it's just sort of disconnected from certain types of thought or certain types of awareness?
Yeah, definitely. I really loved, there's a couple anecdotes that I have, but one that I really loved when I was installing the Swampbabes show was, I was like, carrying all these monitors like into the shop and like starting to turn them on, and there's this one video that I really loved. It was basically footage of like a side-scrolling Mario game, but it was like had all these like video effects on it and like practical video effects on it. It was like really beautiful, and these young boys were walking by, and they stopped and they're like staring at this Mario video, and they're like, they didn't. I don't even think they realized that like something was weird about it. They just saw like Mario footage, and they're like staring at it, and like went out and talked to him, and they're like, "Oh yeah, Mario! Like I play that at home. Like I know how to beat Mario. Like I know all the tricks in Mario." I'm like that's like I love that. Like I love that like you like these kids like who just like I know how to beat Mario are now seeing like Mario art like on the sidewalk where like it's not an art space at all, but they're experiencing Mario art, and like that's there's so many like connections that they're making in their head that they probably aren't even thinking about now, but like they're always going to remember that like weird Mario video that they saw one day on the sidewalk, and that's like a really hopefully is like a sort of like transformative experience, and like seeing game footage like on the street in like a weird window, like that seems so vital to me, and that seems so of like like happenings in like the 60s and 70s, and like what like those sorts of things did for art and like modern art and contemporary art. Like we need that for video games too. Like video games need to have like an in-person liveliness too, and like a weirdness and like a sort of unexplained quality, and be mysterious and of ritual, and sort of be like upsetting like the everyday mundane schedule that we're all on, and the opposite is happening. Like video games are becoming more and more of like a service that you like log into once a day and like turn your brain off for an hour every night, and you can have both of those things, but like don't forget like the first one. Like the first one's so vital to like keeping video games special and exciting, and like And I think that that quality, like, you know, almost trickles back up into mainstream gaming. Like, if enough, like, weird things are happening at, like, a low level of gaming, like, all that stuff, like, trickles back up into, like, large mainstream gaming and, like, affects large mainstream gaming, too. Like, you know, they get their ideas from, like, smaller projects.
It's interesting. I mean, I feel like the contrast in behavior that shape perceptions about whatever is perceived as like the video game audience, like the sorts of things, I don't know that we touched on them necessarily. We'll touch on it before I let you go, but
Sure.
you know, all of these things feel like, well, these feel like things born out of the way people behave on the internet, and so you could sort of fantasize, although it would be a weird thing. You know, if they had stayed, I mean, because for me growing up, like the perception was like, oh, well, be careful in the arcade because, you know, kids will try to sell you drugs or something.
Good.
And so, good.
Yeah, good.
My parents may want a word with you. But like for example, it's interesting how, you know, despite the fact you look at like many of the video games of like the 70s and 80s, and like just how psychedelic they could be in general, it's weird how like that's not a perception of the video game space of it like being a druggy space. You know, it's much more of just the mundane, usual ways people are shitty to each other on the internet. So, I mean, I was trying to think about this. I mean, you know this better than I because you were talking about it in our email, but you know, you were talking about this portable channel 1972 tape about filmmakers going to the Kodak factory demanding to see film or something, or demanding to see
the facilities where the film that they were using had been made.
So, I mean, I was just trying to think about, like, you know, can we imagine anything similar to that in video games? But it might make sense if you sort of like lay context for like what that footage is and like why it sort of sprang to mind, and you know, the fact that like I've been thinking about it for a couple of days. I still can't think of like, well, what would that be? You know, in video games, like I can't really think of it. So like I feel like that says something too.
Yeah. Do you want me to explain what the video is a little bit, or like give it some context?
Yeah, if you don't mind, because I only know what you told me in an email before, and then I paraphrased it even. I truncated it, explaining it here.
So the school that I go to, Visual Studies Workshop, we have like a huge film and video archive that I do a lot of work with. And one of like the collections in the archive is the portable channel collection, which is all these like mostly open reel videotapes shot in like the early 70s, and it goes into like the 80s. All these different kinds of portable channel videos. Portable channel was this, you know, sort of like hippie video art collective in western central New York back then, and they did a lot of really great, you know, segments for public access TV, and they did a lot of art videos, and they worked with a lot of communities to like sort of publish their own, you know, video work. This is all like very early video stuff. And there's this really great video where Bonnie Klein, who's a member of Portable Channel, you know, like leads these, you know, Portable Channel members to the Kodak factory, which is in Rochester, New York. My father actually used to work there. And they go in and they want to like see the facility, you know, that's making the film that they use. And like the security guard is just like, you can't come in here, like basically like, fuck you guys, like you're not coming in here. And it's like really radical, and it's like kind of funny, but it's also like very, you know, indicative of this sort of like gatekeeping, and like it's just like a really great scene. And so I was like, I love that. Like I feel like that scene really furthers how we think about, you know, film and video and like large manufacturers and all these things, and it's like thinking about why, like, what's the video game equivalent of that? Like, if I think that like really furthered thinking about, you know, these things, like what's the video game equivalent of that? And like, I don't know, like, should I like go into, you know, like what even like Activision's headquarters or something, and like it's like act like an asshole like in the lobby or something? Like, I don't know, like the world doesn't work that way anymore. You know, things are so much more, you know, secured, and there's so much more security, and you know, things are a lot more just like locked up in general. And things are also like just like less physical in general. You know?
I was going to say that may be part of why it's challenging to think of a parallel.
Yeah, you know, there is no, you know, film, video, you know, for like video game, like all of, like most video gaming is just like completely digital, and it's very, you know, hands off and not tangible. And it's, I don't know. Yeah, I think there's something we put on an air as a society now that we're more civil, I think, than people did in the 60s and 70s. You know, like, happenings don't happen the way they used to happen, and we don't prod, you know, the powers, you know, like the powers the way that artists and activists used to, I think, especially in regard to like, you know, manufacturers and like companies like that. So I don't know. I mean, Bonnie Clyde and Portable Channel had the benefit of like being in the town that, you know, Kodak was also in. So like maybe I would feel differently about this if I lived where there were like, you know, large game companies, but that's not really the case here. But I can't really imagine that.
I think the only thing, I mean, it'd be some sort of Tron-like situation.
Yeah, exactly. But even like, you know, thinking about like the Steam home page, for instance, you know, like you can't, like, it's completely impenetrable. Like, it's not like a physical space. You know, there's no, you can't get into it. You know, you can't do anything. You can't interact with it like that.
Well, there's been this thing for a long time where game companies feel like their job is to basically build a giant mirror outside of everything they do. I interviewed Sid Meier yesterday for this.
Oh, cool.
And was talking to him about you know, you're the guy with your name on the box, and you famously didn't want to have your name on the box. And you know, did you ever think about how if more people's names were on the boxes, you know, would we see like less antagonism from, you know, audience at large, portion of the audience at all? And I mean, I would agree, you know, as he kind of said that, like, well, that, you know, it's kind of a broader internet thing. It is true that like it is a known issue in video games stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But there's this attitude of like, well, the player is the star, we're not the star. And it's like, I guess, but I didn't decide to make, you know, Assassin's Creed 2.
Yeah.
Like, can't I be a little curious about why Assassin's Creed is?
Yeah.
And the answer is no.
Uh-huh. Well, that's a really interesting. I had never really thought about that before, of being like the player is the star, and to me that's sort of like that sounds like a problem. You know.
Yeah.
I think that's a problem. You know, we don't, and I think it's very much unique to video games. And
Yeah.
I understand why it is, because I think, a lot of like the origins of like modern games are like, like how do we get players to, feel like they're Link, how do they relate to Link? Like they are the hero, they are like the superhero, and like superhero is like really problematic. Like don't feel like a hero, be very suspicious of being a hero, like I think that's a problem with games, and it's right there.
Well, you said, and this is sort of, one of the last big areas I wanted to explore with you, and I'm glad you brought up Zelda because, I mean, you said, games don't really let us explore our feelings much, and I often wonder, I'm like, well, that's a good point, and I agree, but I always wonder, like, well, same thing with like, well, maybe games just aren't good enough yet that they don't inspire more broadly the sort of criticism we'd like to see. I often wonder, like, well, is this asking too much of games right now to do that? And I think, I mean, you mentioned that thing. I mean, I copy pasted it. Maybe it would be better to just ask you to restate it. The whole thing about how how you basically posed the question of like, well, how can anyone have played Link to the Past and also be like a ruthless, rude jerk?
Yeah, I mean, exactly. I'm tearing up a little bit just thinking about it because like it's so sad. It's really sad. So yeah, what I said was, to me, one of the most like sort of like crystal clear, endearing, moments of like understanding, your surroundings in sort of mainstream games is in Legend of Zelda: Link to the Past, when you're in the light world and you see how like the light world operates, and you understand like the space of the light world and all of its inhabitants and like all of the like natural, environments in the light world, and then you get thrust into the dark world, and it's like this dark world parallel of all those things. It's like a disfigured version of all those things, and like a lot of the characters have like disfigured, counterparts, and the landscape is like slightly askew, and it takes a lot of understanding of like, and it takes patience, understanding, and like sensitivity to sort of understand both of those spaces, as they parallel each other, and understand their differences, and understand, sort of like the magic bond that they have. And like, it takes so much sensitivity to do that. And obviously it's like The Legend of Zelda: Link to the Past is like not another human being, but it's different than watching like a movie about, two people who are in love or whatever. Like, it's different than reading a book about, people's relationships. It's like you're doing it, you have to be sensitive and patient and like understand these spaces and these characters, and like understand like this like myth that you're fulfilling, and like this like very complicated ritual that you're enacting. And like pretty much every, quote-unquote gamer has played through this sequence, has played The Legend of Zelda: Link to the Past. And yet, like, so much of gamer culture is fueled by, like, hatred and rage and, like, shitposting and just, like, being nasty to each other on the internet. And it's like, how could you, like, miss that so much? Like, how could you miss the point of navigating, like, this, like, like beautiful dream, and just like forego all of that and not come out a more sensitive person? Like, I don't know. Like, again, like I'm thinking about it, I'm like tearing up because it's like, it's so endearing, like how sensitive and like, like dreamlike and spiritual it is. And there's just like, you don't see that very often being portrayed as like being part of gamer, quote unquote gamer culture. Like, it's not there, and I question that, and I don't know how that like doesn't have a lasting effect, because like most games are about, like being, some sort of force of good or justice, like against like fascism, often like a cartoon version of fascism, but like that's what games are about, but like there's just like, it doesn't translate in its audience like to the real world, and it's really sad.
It's interesting to think about, and I think what really struck me was, I mean, I don't know, hopefully it doesn't sound jerky when I'm saying like, yeah, I don't even know what gamer culture is, because, I mean, for one thing, like those are just both words that have a lot of baggage separately,
Sure.
but together it's so nebulous. But the thing that really struck me, and I'm still thinking about it, and I'm going to keep thinking about it after we get off the phone, is it's interesting to tie it to a specific experience in contrast to a broader known trend. Because I hadn't thought about it in that way. And I hadn't thought about the game in that way. And I've played that game, and I guess maybe the closest I've ever come to it is just wondering, is there some point we've all gone through, people who care about video games, like could that have been any of us, like winding up behaving that way? Like, did we zig somewhere they zagged? And it does kind of boggle the mind of like, I mean, I think you were saying about like, games need to be a little bit more upfront about this kind of dissonance and to help people explore feelings more. I feel like, is it really because there was like no winking in video games ever, where it's like, like there was never a point in Dark Souls where like you're running around in your underwear because you can and killing things, but is it because there's never a point in the game where they're like, yeah, but don't really kill things and people though?
Right. Yeah.
I guess video games would be way less popular and very strange if they are continually breaking the fourth wall.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know.
Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead. No, you go ahead.
I was just gonna say there's some really beautiful games that do exactly that. Like, Undertale is all about that. Like choosing to be a pacifist even when like the game's mechanics are telling you to fight. And that, like, that's totally, like, that's really powerful. That's like a really powerful thing to, give players the choice to do that. And like most players probably are going to be, pacifists once they kind of, know what the game is about. And so I love seeing things like that. I started playing this game called Moon RPG on Switch. I don't know if you're familiar with it. It's I think it came out in 1997 originally, but it had never been officially translated. It just came out on Switch. I think Tim Rogers did the translation for it. It's really great. And that also has like a similar vibe to Undertale, where it's, it's sort of set up as this Dragon Quest, story where like there's like a hero and he's like killing animals because like that's what a hero does. They kill animals for experience points and gold. And then like you're sort of this like secondary character who has to go around and like sort of heal the spirits of all the animals that the hero kills. And like that's such a great, metaphor, and like, and it's sort of like, like what is Moon RPG doing? It's like a perversion of the Dragon Quest formula, which is like goes back to like Dragon Pervert, which is also like a perversion of, the Dragon Quest formula. And so like those two things are connected in my head. But what I love about Moon and Undertale is that like, we're dealing with these game mechanics, but from like a pacifist's, point of view, and like what happens in these worlds that are set up for violence. Like you're not being the violent person anymore. Like how do we deal with these things? And Moon RPG is really great. Like you go around and you like talk to people. You just like go around and talk to people and like help people, and it's really quite lovely. And that's like a game that has verbs that are more than just, kill, fight, win, battle.
Well, I have just one last question here for you. Unless was there some territory or area you wanted to get into that just didn't come up yet?
Not maybe. Let me think about it. You can go ahead.
Don't tell me what to do. I only have one question left to ask you. There's nothing else I can do.
Well,
if you need a moment, that's totally fine.
I don't know. I hope I said everything that I needed to say. Yeah, I think I said everything that I needed to say. Well, at least that I can think of right now.
Well, that's all. I think you can hope for.
Yeah.
So let me ask you this then.
Sure.
What do you think video games have accomplished?
Yeah. I mean, at the very least, I think video games have, they've really established themselves as this, medium that, draws out passion and, creativity, and it's so inspiring. And, I think there are certain, like, points in video game history that do that particularly well. For instance, like, Earthbound comes to mind, and, like, everyone who played Earthbound is sort of like, they say this about, like, the Velvet Underground, like, everyone who listened to the Velvet Underground, like, started their own band. Like, everyone who played Earthbound, like, became at least some sort of, like, indie dev and, like, wanted to, like, make, like, a weird RPG. And so, like those moments feel really vital and radical to me. And, like, I think as video games, like, the tools that, you use to make video games become more streamlined and accessible, like, more and more voices and, like, different types of artists can use the language of video games to, like, make new experiences and, like, share their voices and stories and dreams, and like, I think that's when video games get really interesting, when the power to create video games is, like, sort of in the hands of the people, as opposed to, like, being sort of, very, like, super technical, and, like, you need to be, like, very skilled and, like, knowledgeable and to know how to make games. So, things like Twine and RPG Maker is always, like, the one that I cite as, like, being very powerful. But Twine's really great, and, like, all, like, the Unity stuff is really exciting. And but, like, going back to, like, mainstream games like Mario and Zelda and, like, those sorts of things that I think most of the people I'm talking to grew up with. And, like, I think those kinds of stories, especially Zelda, I mean, like, Zelda's the best. It just feels like such a dream, and it draws out this kind of, like, magic, feeling in the person who's playing it, and, like, that makes them want to, make their own games, but also just, like, it hopefully, like, think about the world a little differently. And what else do I want to say about that? I definitely do also think that, like, no, that might be it. I don't know. Yeah, I'm not sure what else to say about that. I think that coming from an art context, I think video game adjacent art is the most radical art right now, and, like, that's really exciting to me. And there's, like, we're at, like, the very bottom of, like, what we can do with video games, and, thinking about new media and, like, new art experiences. Like, we're so low right now in like the history of that. Like there's so much potential. I hope that it doesn't, get squandered or like misinterpreted or whatever and disappears. But I don't think that's true. I think everyone seems to be very excited about video games overall. There's so many like conferences and things, and there's a lot of like literary, like intellectual discourse about video games right now, and there's a lot of interesting voices. I think even if they're just like on Twitter, like they're still there and like they're still talking, and it's great to like keep up that discourse. But I know that one of the points of like being interviewed is like, I think this is right, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it's like somebody, or at least like the original idea of like Don't Die was like people who like kind of stopped playing video games. Is that true? Like people who grew...
you did your homework.
Yeah.
I mean there was something behind that, like a bigger thing, which is just an interest in where are we losing people? Where are there lost sources of insight, and what's alienating them?
Sure.
Just from like a working theory or a feeling that like there's been a revolving door for decades and we keep going in circles.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I guess, to like me personally, like, I'll say like mainstream games don't really have anything to like do with what I'm talking about, and like they don't really, but I'm still, I'm playing a lot of, like micro-sized games and like one dev games and like smaller indie games, and like there's so many like amazing artists out there that like nobody knows about, on like Itch and like Glorious Trainwrecks, and there's so many like unique like tiny things going on, and I hope that those voices kind of get more attention and are understood better and can be contextualized by like institutions that have power. Like I think there was a Glorious Trainwrecks shows at Baby Castles a year or two ago, and like that's very cool. But like I hope that like the curators from like the new museum like saw that, we're like, whoa, like what's going on? Like this is really fascinating, and like we've never really seen anything like this before. Like I hope that sort of pollination is happening, and I think it is. And like I've really devoted a lot of my creative life energy to like thinking about Dragon Quest and like like the biases, and like I hope somebody comes up to me and is like, oh yeah, like the Dragon Quest guy, like that's all I ever wanted in my life. But like thinking about the biases and like binaries and like genre game mechanics, and like how do we question that and how do we subvert that. And honestly, like now more than ever, I feel like audiences are being more receptive to that and like asking questions and like not accepting just like the status quo anymore. So I think that's really great. And like the entire world's like burning down, right? Like literally burning down right now, and there's like so many problems in the world, and like I just like leave my house and I'm like so depressed, and like everything sucks and is like vile, and there's like so much evil in the world. But like thinking about what I just said, like oh yeah, like there's like a glimmer of hope. Like I have a glimmer of hope actually, and I don't say that very often, but I'm gonna say it right now that I think there's a glimmer of hope for the future of games and the future of thinking and making games. And you know, giving new voices, you know, the chance to speak to new audiences. I think that's totally within the realm of reason, and I think it's gonna happen, and it's gonna be a step in the right direction.